Jesus entered a village where a woman whose name was Martha welcomed him. She had a sister named Mary, who sat beside the Lord at his feet, listening to him speak. Martha, burdened with much serving, came to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me by myself to do everything? To tell her to help me?" The Lord said to her in reply, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and worried about many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, and it will not be taken from her." My sisters and brothers, this is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Statement, but summer officially ends today here at St. Matthew's. I say that because next week Bishop Peter and Urella return. So certainly the summer sojourn of having a variety of different presiders and homilists here will end, and we'll have Bishop Peter back next week. So I'm sure everyone will be longing to see him back. At the same time, it's been a great blessing for us to be able to share with you. I know, where did Father Nick went? He was here. I guess he was, he doesn't feel well.
He wasn't feeling well.
Yeah, okay. Well, Father Nick, who presided a couple weeks, to Steve Smith, who preached, Pastor Mike, Mother Janine, Mother Martha, and Father Jerry. We had a wonderful time here this summer. But again, Bishop Peter will be back next week. So this morning we have a story in the Gospels that's probably almost as iconic as the one we had last week. Last week we heard the story of the Good Samaritan. And Pastor Mike, when he shared with us, he reminded us that the story of the Good Samaritan has really become inculcated into our culture. I mean, when you say Good Samaritan, everyone knows what that means. In fact, we even now have a law called the Good Samaritan Law, which protects people who are trying to help out from lawsuits and things like that. Well, the story today, if you say the two names together, Martha and Mary, you get a similar response from most people in our culture. They get the gist of what that means. The story of Martha and Mary. Before Mass today, I was actually speaking with David, and he indicated something which I think everyone here would recognize, and that is that there is no end to sermon material in this particular story. It's a very simple story, and it's just a brief paragraph in the Gospels, and I'll recount it. Jesus goes into a village. He's sitting at a table with some folks, But actually, he's probably out in the living room, sitting there with some folks, and Martha's running around doing everything. And she comes to Jesus and said, "Lord, make my sister get up and do something. I'm doing it all." And of course, he says to her, we know these words, "Martha, Martha, you're so anxious about everything. Mary has chosen, basically, to be with me, and she has chosen the better part." And so it's, I can do a homily on anxiety. We have lots of things to be anxious about, don't we? If you think about it. Everyone sitting here in this church, we have a home or an apartment to go home to. We've got food in our cabinets. We've got, some of us have at least a little bit of money in the bank. We have cars that, other than our bishop, that generally operate, and hopefully we're going to take care of that together. But we think about our lives and we look around the world and we have so little to really be anxious about, and yet all we have to do is turn on, CNN or Fox or whatever, and in 5 minutes you can get about 10 things to be anxious about. It's not what you do. We worry about whether we're going to have health insurance or whether I'm going to, whether my retirement plan will still be there. All these different things we have to think about, and we do get anxious about. I do. I preaching to myself. But what I really wanted to talk about this morning was I want to take a slightly different direction with Martha and Mary this morning. Our gospel this morning is from Luke. Now, Luke is the third in the third of the three synoptics, and it's cycle C in our liturgical cycle. What's interesting about Luke is not an eyewitness to the events that he records in the gospel. He's very clear about that. He says, he's talking to a Roman official named Theophilus. He says, "Oh, Theophilus, I'm writing to you an account of all the things that Jesus did. And I'm doing that based on all these sources that I've pulled together. I've pulled together the best information on this, and now I'm recounting these events based on all these sources I have before me." And we presume, it's almost unanimous among biblical scholars, that one of the things he had before him was the Gospel of Mark, which was an eyewitness account. And so Luke is pulling all this together, and so when we come to this passage this morning about Martha and Mary, it sounds a little bit sterile, a little bit generic, right? Jesus goes into a town and there's a woman named Martha, and there's a woman named Mary, and he recounts this story. Well, if we go to the Gospel of John, we gain incredible insight into who Martha and Mary actually were. These are not just two people that Jesus was having dinner with on a certain occasion. These are two women who are in the inner part of Jesus' inner circle. You don't get any closer to Jesus than Martha and Mary and their brother Lazarus, along with his closest disciples, John and James and Peter and Andrew. This is the people that really make up his inner circle. And Martha and Mary somehow have come to be very, very close to Jesus. They are what we would say in our lingo today, they are very close personal friends. We know this because in John, we know the story, first of all, of the death of Lazarus. Jesus and his disciples at this point are under tremendous threat, and so they've kind of gone off, and they're in the outback. They're in some areas of Judea where nobody goes. They're in they're out in the wilderness hiding, essentially. And still somehow they get word to him that Lazarus is sick. And we know that story. Jesus says, well, it's not a sickness unto death, and he just waits a couple more days, and of course we know Lazarus dies. Jesus comes walking into the village of Bethany, and Martha has a sense of Jesus. She is close enough to him that she can come and she can chide Jesus. She can say, "Lord, where have you been? If you had come, my brother wouldn't have died." She's bawling Jesus out. She was close enough to him that she could be utterly frank with her feelings about what she felt. And of course, we know Jesus' response, Martha in the resurrection, and we know the story. Jesus heals, or he raises Lazarus from the dead, restores him to life. In the next chapter, Jesus is now at a dinner table with Martha and Mary and Lazarus. They're all there. And what does John tell us? He says, Jesus loved Martha and Mary. They were close, deep friends of Jesus. What else do we learn about Mary? At that dinner, Mary takes a jar of ointment or oil, and she pours it over Jesus' feet. and she takes her hair and she wipes his feet with her hair. This is a very, very intimate and almost scandalous thing that Mary does. But her love and her closeness for Jesus, this is how she expresses it. There's a bit of I guess you could say, a scholarly argument among the scholars. In fact, Martha, I'm going to ask you a question in a minute. We're not sure, but many biblical scholars believe that Mary of Bethany is Mary Magdalene. Yeah, and it makes sense because right after the resurrection, when they're in Bethany, all of a sudden she's the first one at the tomb. And so there's really good, I think there's very good arguments. I certainly lean in that direction very strongly. But earlier in the book of Luke, there's another really interesting story. And you might remember this from earlier, about 2 months ago in the liturgical cycle. There was a story where Jesus was sitting in a Pharisee's house having dinner, and this woman comes in off the street, and it's made very clear that she is a woman of the street. And she washes Jesus' feet with her tears and wipes his feet with her hair. And again, many scholars think that that was Mary Magdalene, who Jesus casts out 7 demons from. Jesus delivered her from this life that she was living. And she is fully restored. And at this point, she seems to be expressing her gratitude to Jesus. And then she repeats the same event right before the events of the Passion Week, as she's with Jesus at dinner. The point I'm making is that there is this intense friendship that had developed. We don't know how the best explanation for why there's this closeness and why Jesus has adopted Mary and Martha, Mary, and Lazarus is because of his relationship with Mary, and he's come into that family, and they have befriended him, and he has taken them on as these very close personal friends. But as we look around the inner group of Jesus, we see, John, the beloved disciple. We see James, his brother, and many of you have heard me talk about that. It's very good scholarly evidence that those are Jesus' first cousins. And he would have had long-time relationships with them, and he was very close to them. He knew Peter and Andrew because they were in a fishing business with John and James, and so he had developed relationships with them well before his ministry started. And so these are all very close and personal friends to Jesus when he starts his ministry. At the resurrection, all of that certainly would have changed in some ways, because all of a sudden this man who they had walked with, who died, in fact, John the beloved disciple was right there as Jesus expired. They were close to him in life. They were his dear personal friends. The resurrection changed that, but it only made it stronger. Because now in the resurrection, and we heard it this morning in Paul's reading, they were now filled with the Spirit of Christ. Christ was now not just their friend, but he was in them. It was the hope of their glory. But what I want to focus on is this issue of friendship. When I was younger and I went through the Jesus movement back in the early 1970s, one of the things we talked about, and there were two buzzwords. One was being born again. Many of you probably remember that. And the other one was to have a personal relationship with Jesus. That's how we talked about it. It's interesting, in the Roman Catholic Church now, they have actually adopted this idea that you have a friendship with Jesus. Isn't that interesting? That's current in the Roman Catholic Church now. It's becoming an emphasis in how they talk about Jesus. I just read a book. I read lots of books. Those who know me know, I read a lot of books. But this is a really unique book I just read. It's called 7 Men. Now, sorry ladies, it's not misogynist. He wrote the book very specifically for men because he feels that we have, maybe a lack of good male roles in our culture today. The author is Eric Metaxas. Many of you probably haven't heard of him. He recently, before he wrote this book, he wrote a book on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Probably the most important biography on Bonhoeffer that's been written in decades. And it's a fantastic book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And even more so, I recommend this book. He actually has a chapter on Bonhoeffer in here. But what he does is he talks about 7 men and how they changed their world. How they literally, in fact, in some cases, they changed the world. And what makes it important is every one of the men he talks about in this book were very close friends of Jesus. Every one of them had a deep and abiding friendship with Jesus. The first one he talks about, I'm going to focus on a couple because we don't have time to go through all 7. The first one he talks about is George Washington. And something, we always hear that, were the founding fathers Christians? Well, some of them were deists, as we know. George Washington was a profoundly devout Christian and was often seen in the mornings and evenings when people would come to his study to meet with him. They would find him on his knees praying. He was a very devout Christian. And in fact, God spared him. There was divine providence, I'm convinced, as he was a younger man, and as he fought in some of the early, like the French and Indian War and things like that, that there was one case where he walked out of a battle where he had bullet holes through his clothes, through his hat, and he was untouched. God was protecting that man for greater things. The second man in this book is someone who, some of you may have heard the name, some of you maybe haven't, but it's William Wilberforce. Who has heard of William Wilberforce? There's a few. William Wilberforce was born in England in the late 1700s, I think about 1760, somewhere in that range. And his parents were very wealthy. They had a very successful business on the coast of Britain. And so he was raised in a lap of luxury, and when he was 9, his father died, and his mother also became very ill, and he was shipped off to live with an aunt and uncle. Well, unbeknownst to his mother, when she found out about it, it disturbed her, but unbeknownst to his mother, his aunt and uncle had been swept up in the Wesleyan revival in England, and they were very devout. They had been born again. They were friends of Jesus. And so they started raising this young boy in the Christian faith. And he became a very devout young man as a young boy. When his mother found out about it, she was enraged, made him come back, and she did everything she could to try to destroy his faith, because she felt it was just not suitable for him to live this type of life. And so he then entered back into the life of luxury and became actually incredibly successful. He was known in school, and everything that he did is absolutely amazing. And in fact, at the age of 20, was elected to the English Parliament. Today, still the youngest person who's ever been elected to the English Parliament at the age of 20. But his faith had grown cold. He decided after about 4 years, he decided to take a vacation. And he asked a couple of friends if they would go with him, and nobody could for whatever reasons, because they were going to be in a coach for a number of weeks as they traveled through the French countryside. And so he finally found a friend, a man named Isaac Milner, to accompany him. So it was just the two of them in this coach traveling, hours every day through the French countryside. And what he didn't know was that Milner was also a friend of Jesus. He was a deeply committed Christian. And so conversations about politics and things ultimately led to religion. And over that trip, Wilberforce became deeply troubled because he recognized that he had given up something that this man now had. And so he started a search. When he returned from this trip, he looked up an old pastor, someone he had known from his youth. He looked up a man by the last name of Newton. Does that name ring a bell with anyone? John Newton, who wrote the song Amazing Grace, was a pastor in England at the time. So Wilberforce reignited his relationship with Newton, who led him back into a deep, deep Christian faith. Wilberforce didn't know what to do at that point. He's a politician with incredible power. I was like, what do I do now? I'm living this Christian faith. Does that somehow balance with what I'm doing in my Christian faith? And Newton said, absolutely. Wilberforce then spent the next 40 years combating slavery. He was the man who was responsible for the end of slavery in England. In 1938, the final bill was signed to outlaw slavery in England, and Wilberforce was the man who made that happen. And it was because he was a friend of Jesus. And it was that event which then ultimately led to the ending of slavery in our country. He died 3 days after that bill was signed. He changed his world because he was a friend of Jesus. The next man in the book is a man named Eric Liddell. Except for those who were at the 8 o'clock mass. Has anyone here heard of Eric Liddell? Martha, who was Eric Liddell?
He was an Olympic runner who refused to run during the Olympics on a Sunday.
Yeah.
If you ever saw the movie Chariots of Fire.
Yeah. He is the main character in that movie, Chariots of Fire. It came out in the early 1980s. He was born in China on the mission field. His parents were missionaries in China. He was born there. And then as a young man, he was sent back to Scotland for his schooling. And it was discovered while he was in school in Scotland that he was an incredible athletic talent. We would today say he was a world-class athlete. And in fact, he was. And so ultimately, he ended up on the Scottish track team for the Olympics in 1924. When he found out that the heats for the 100-meter dash, which is what he would have been running, when he found out that the heats were on a Sunday, he said, I can't run. And of course, it created this major stir among British society and certainly among the Scottish Olympic Committee. But he stuck to his guns and he refused to run the 100-meter dash, which he was the favorite in, because he said, it's on a Sunday and I will honor my Lord. I will honor my friend Jesus. And I will forego the fame and glory of an Olympic gold medal in the 100-meter dash, or 100-yard dash at the time. But he did qualify for the what's called the quarter mile at the time, not the 400-meter. He did qualify for that, though he wasn't the fastest runner in the qualifying heats. The day of that event, the finals, he found in his locker, someone had slipped a note into his locker. Sorry. And that note said, he who honors me, I will honor. He won the 400 meter. Set a world's record in the Olympics that day. And used his fame while he was still in Scotland, because everybody wanted him to come as a speaker, and so he would always share his testimony, his Christian faith, his friendship with Jesus. Shortly after that, he retired from track and field. He never ran again competitively. He went to seminary, was ordained, and went back to the mission. He went to the mission field to China. He served there through the First World War. The Japanese invaded. He ultimately was interned in a Japanese internment camp, and that's where so he died in an internment camp in Japan. He was a friend of Jesus. The next man is also an athlete, someone you will have heard of, undoubtedly. But you may not know that he was a close friend of Jesus, and that's Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson grew up in the Los Angeles area, and so while he knew racism, he didn't know it, as it had existed in other parts of the country. Branch Rickey, who was the general manager of the Dodgers at the time, was also a very devout Christian. He was a friend of Jesus, and he decided that he was going to be the one to end the black-white divide in Major League Baseball. He was going to bring in someone to cross the color barrier, as they called it. But he needed someone who had incredible integrity and strength, but who was also a really good baseball player. And he found that man in Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson was also known for having a really bad temper, even though he was a Christian. And it was exhibited at times when he was in the South and when he served in the military during World War II. He was in the South, and many times, the segregation laws really upset him. Again, coming from Los Angeles, where he hadn't experienced nearly so much, he ended up in jail a couple of times just because he confronted the authorities and said, I'm not going to sit on the back of the bus. And he ended up in jail. But Branch Rickey made him promise. He said, you're a Christian, you are going to do this, and you have to promise me that you will never retaliate. You are going to be called names, you are going to have the ball thrown at your head, you are going to get cleated, you are going to be struck, and you are going to be faithful to your God, and you are not going to retaliate. And that is exactly what happened. He went through the first number of seasons, and over time, he not only won over his teammates to his side, but ultimately he won over the entire league to the point where he was voted as the most valuable player in the league. And now he's in the Baseball Hall of Fame. But he didn't do that because of political correctness. He did it because he was a friend of Jesus. He had a commitment. And as a friend of Jesus, he saw the good that he could do if he was faithful in carrying out what Branch Rickey asked him to do, and he did it. There's other people in this book, again, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who most of you have heard of if you haven't. Eric Metaxas has written this incredible biography on him, and again, I highly recommend it. He also talks about Pope John Paul II is one of the 7 men that he talks about. The last man that he talks about in this book, did I give him all? Who did I miss? Got George Washington, Wilberforce, Liddell, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Jackie Robinson. Yeah, okay, so I've got everyone except the last one that he talks about again is someone who you will recognize the name, and you may have seen Saturday Night Live skits about him. That's Charles Colson. Charles Colson was the right-hand man of Richard Nixon, and was, deeply, involved in the whole Watergate scandal, and ultimately went to prison for his involvement in that affair. Before he went to prison, though, and he went to prison voluntarily, he confessed to a crime that he wasn't even being accused of. Because while he was involved in all of the events leading up to it, and the storm clouds were on the horizon, he was meeting with a man, a defense contractor, the president of Raytheon, which is a huge defense contractor. And this man had just himself come to Christ. And he shared his conversion with Charles Colson. Charles Colson had been raised in the church, but had long since left that behind, and he was a man of this incredible power in the dizzying heights of Washington. But as he sat there in the office of this man, he listened to his story. The man gave him Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis and said, here, read this. So he was a serious man. He took the book, took a bunch of yellow legal pads, and then sat down with the book for a number of days and went through it. And at the end of that, he sat down and he asked Jesus to come into his heart. He never again practiced law. He never again was involved in politics. While he was in prison, He promised the prisoners there that he would come and he would visit them and he would help to change their lives. And he was faithful to that promise. And he ended up beginning a prison ministry called Prison Fellowship. That's an international ministry that is still very active today and has probably done more to reform prisons and to change the lives of prisoners than any ministry going, and has literally touched the lives of tens or hundreds of thousands of prisoners because he met and became a friend of Jesus. Each of us have been called to be a friend of Jesus. Each of us have been called to share our friendship that we have with this man who laid down his life for us almost 2,000 years ago. We have each been called to not only be a friend, but to share that friendship with those around us. Each of the men in this book changed their world in some ways that we can't even fathom. The ending of slavery, the breaking of the color line, the founding of this country. These men did great things because they were friends of Jesus, and yet each of us is called to do the same. We may only be able to affect one person. We may be able to take food to the shelter and touch one person by doing that. But each of us is called to share our friendship with the one who we call Lord. And when we do that, we extend the kingdom of God around us. And we do what we are ultimately called to do, and that is to be faithful followers of someone who, how do I say this? Steve Smith said that to me, so I'm going to repeat what Steve said. He said, ultimately, this isn't about doctrines or rules or laws. It's ultimately about a relationship. Each of us has a relationship with Jesus. It sounds, kind of passé, but we each have a personal relationship with Jesus. And so let us go forth today and reflect on that, and let us affect the world around us with the love that we have for our great friend. And that is the good news of the gospel.
Amen.